Welcome everyone to the American Battlefield Trust. We've got a fantastic field trip for you here in Mobile, Alabama. I'm Kris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War for the American Battlefield Trust. Behind the camera right now, but making his way in front of the camera, certainly throughout this trip, is our fabulous friend Garry Adelman. And coming on in just a few minutes is my lifelong life partner, Kris White, who's going to really outline the battle here. We are at Fort Morgan, one of the most historic places all along the coast. And we've got great layers of history that we're going to unfold for you. This is a compelling story to share with you as Alabama enters into the war in a serious way in 1864. Now it's funny because we really focus on Alabama early on as part of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan as he's trying to choke off traffic along the coastline, up and down the East Coast and here in the Gulf. So he's going to send Admiral David Farragut down in this area to be in charge of cutting off the coast. But he's also then going to have to divide his fleet from here also to take care of things over in New Orleans and choke things up the Mississippi River. So Farragut's not going to be able to give his full attention to Mobile early in the war, which is why it starts coming in later. There's going to be several attempts to maybe we should start looking at it in 1863. After Vicksburg falls in the summer of 63, Grant's going to be like, oh, maybe we should look at Mobile, but it's really not going to get the attention that it deserves from the Union effort until later in 1864. The Confederates, meanwhile, have pretty good fortifications here, not only here at Fort Morgan, but across the bay behind me. We see Fort Gaines, 3 miles across this open channel. A lot of people think that this is a big, huge open bay, but in fact, it's a very narrow channel protected by 3 forts. Fort Morgan here, named after Revolutionary War hero Daniel Morgan. Across the way, we've got Fort Gaines, and then Fort Powell is sort of guarding the back way into the bay. And between those 3 forts, the Confederates are able to keep things pretty closed off. There's going to be a number of blockade runners that are going to run up and down through this using speed to get past the Federal blockade, which is going to be off to my right in the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, the bay itself is going to stretch some 33 miles to the north, where it ends at Mobile. I shouldn't say it ends because there's a fabulous, fantastic delta up in that area. Tens of thousands of not square miles, square meters of delta land up in that direction. But Mobile at the time of the war, it's the 27th largest city in the United States. But when secession comes along, it becomes the 4th largest city in the Confederacy after New Orleans, Charleston, and then Richmond. It's got a population of about 30,000. So it's going to become a really important center here for the South to move goods, move troops, move resources through the deep South. It's going to be an important transportation hub, not only because of the seaway that we see behind us, but the railway that the rail junctures that are going to meet in Mobile itself. Now, it's tough for those 2 transportation systems to meet up because about 2/3 of the way up the bay in that direction, there's going to be the Dog River Sandbar, which is going to stretch almost all the way across this bay. That means that there's only going to be about an 8 or 9 foot draft when the water is really low. So seafaring ships can't sail all the way up into the bay and all the way to Mobile. They can only go as far as that sandbar. And so there are going to be commerce folks that are going to use what are called camels, basically to kind of move things over the sandbar. You're going to load goods into smaller boats, get them over the sandbar, and then put them back into larger boats to get all the way up to Mobile. So that's going to prove to be a major impediment to any effort by the U.S. Navy to move up into the bay and actually get Mobile itself. So these are all factors that are in play when David Farragut finally turns his attention to try to capture Mobile. And to talk about that effort, I'm going to ask my good friend Kris White to come on here, and he's going to talk a little bit about what Farragut's looking to do and how he's going to do it.
Thought about just jumping on camera like Kris Mackowski normally does. So thanks everybody for having us out. Thanks, Kris. And Mobile is one of my favorite places to come. And if you get a chance to, please share this with your friends and your family. Go over to our YouTube channel, click subscribe, and be sure to check out all the videos we have about not just Mobile, but all these other topics. We have animated maps, we have virtual reality, we have Infor videos, we have all kinds of different things. But Kris was starting to set up what it would look like down here in Mobile, and I like to use some interpretive things for you. This is one of my techniques, and this is the claw. And this is what the Gulf Coast is going to look like to us here. And we'll give you a better map, but I want you to imagine 3 very important cities here. One would be over here towards my index finger, and that's Pensacola. Pensacola is behind the camera, roughly an hour and 15-minute drive to the east. Pensacola is a natural harbor and a bay that was first settled by the Spanish. The Spanish will be over here. They will have what's called East Florida. Then we're going to move into West Florida, which turns into Mississippi, Alabama, as well as Louisiana. Towards the middle, towards the webbing of my hand here, we'll have Mobile Bay. We're down at the mouth of Mobile Bay. And then if you move about 2.5 hours to the west of us, you have New Orleans, which is straight off in that direction. So if you have this sort of claw here, this will give you an idea of what the Gulf looks like. And then we have barrier islands. We're on one of those barrier islands right now here in Gulf Shores on Mobile Point. The next island down will be Dauphin Island, and then you will have other islands as you keep moving out into that direction. So this is what it's going to look like. Now, as we swing to the north and look towards Mobile Bay, the Gulf of Mexico is directly behind the camera right now. Think about Mobile Bay, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, as a drainage system for lower Alabama. What is going to happen is actually that delta system that Kris talked about is actually 40 miles long and 10 miles wide. It's 200,000 acres, and it consists of more than 12,000 miles of inland waterways. It's going to consist of the Tombigbee River. You're going to have the Tensas River, the Mobile River, and that can go up towards Selma, up towards Montgomery, but all of that is flowing south down here into Mobile Bay. Mobile Bay starts whenever you get up to around the city of Mobile, which was originally on a place called 27 Mile Bluff. That was founded around 1702, and it only lasts about 10 years. Then it moves down to its setting currently, which is about 32 miles as the crow flies to the north of us. So Mobile Bay is vast. And then to move down into this area, you'll end up into the mouth of Mobile Bay. So what we have is this drainage system that's actually pouring down here into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, to counter this, you have to bring in ships to get up into that Mobile Bay, and that is where the United States Navy will come into play. Now, the history of this area starts around 1518 for us, and that's whenever the first Spaniards come into Mobile Bay, kind of find it, they go back, they leave. De Soto will come here for a while, and then eventually in 1702 on the far Dauphin Island, also known as Massacre Island, you will have the first French settlement. And then they will start moving up into the Mobile area, and that is the Lemoyne brothers, Bienville and Iberville. They will move up into that area, and then they will settle this area. To make a long story short, we'll fast forward to the American Revolution, and we will have a man named Bernardo Galvez come through this area, and he is going to capture Mobile in the name of Spain. And then around 1813, the United States comes into this area and claims Alabama for our own. There's in fact 2 battles of the War of 1812 that took place right in front of me, and that's Fort Bower. That was 2 battles. The first one's a U.S. victory, the second one's a British victory, but it comes after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and that means once the British find out that the treaty has been signed, they have to give up this land, and we go back to basically status quo antebellum. But now here we are, we have this newly acquired piece of land. We have this beautiful natural bay, and what we have to do now is fortify it. So you're standing at one of the primary fortifications, and that's Fort Morgan. I'll lay out the other fortifications, and then we're going to explore Fort Morgan.
Hey everybody, now we're inside Fort Morgan. Can you check it out? It looks pretty modern. It looks like we're all in different rooms. No, we have had some technical difficulties for which we apologize, but we secured a lot of B-roll and other things, so we're still going to take you through the fort, and we're going to tell this story, and with no further ado, let's kick it back to Kris White.
Yeah, I'm going to try to pick everything up where we were on site in Fort Morgan. So thanks, Garry. And one of the things I want to say is we're going to have another live video that'll take you right into the fort, but we're going to try to fill in this gap. So as I was saying in the first part of this video, Mobile Bay is massive. We're looking at a bay that runs from the mouth of it up to the city, about 32 miles. So the defense of Mobile is actually down along the Gulf of Mexico, and it's going to be set up along a few different points. And we'll put up a map here to show you. And on the eastern side of the mouth of Mobile Bay will be Mobile Point. and that'll be in Gulf Shores, one of the barrier islands down here in the area. And on Mobile Point will be Fort Morgan, where we're standing. About 3 miles across the mouth of Mobile Bay, across the channel, will be to the west, and that is Fort Gaines. Fort Gaines is another fortification, the sister fort to Fort Morgan. And the idea behind Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan is to create interlocking fields of fire. If you've ever been out to San Francisco is actually a very heavily fortified bay. Alcatraz, the most famous prison probably in the United States, that was actually a Civil War fortification. And they created different forts out there that would create interlocking fields of fire. So the idea here in Mobile was the same thing. The problem was when these forts are built, 1821 and 1819, and it takes a long time for them to be completed, the long-range artillery just isn't long range enough to create that interlocking fields that they need. But as we get closer to the Civil War, we do have cannons that will be able to reach out and touch different parts of Mobile Bay. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So we have Fort Morgan to the east, we have to the west, we have Fort Gaines, and then towards the northwest, in a place called Grants Pass, which will lead you out to Mississippi Sound to the west, and then into Mobile on the east, you'll have Battery Powell. This is a battery that no longer exists. You can go to Fort Morgan, you can go to Fort Gaines, but you can't go to Battery Powell. It's up near where a modern day bridge is. And the idea for Battery Powell was to protect Grants Pass so that the Union fleet that would be out maybe in New Orleans, which is out to the west of Mobile, the Union fleet could actually use the barrier islands and today what we consider the intercoastal waterway to slip into Mobile that way. So Battery Powell will help to protect that insert or that inlet that would bring you up into Mobile Bay from there. And then you have Morgan and Gaines. Now, Fort Morgan is a very expensive fort to build. It took millions of bricks to build this thing and just over $1 million in 1830s money. For the longest time, it was known as the Mobile Point Construction Project. It didn't even have a name until 1833, whenever the fort is named after Daniel Morgan, one of the Revolutionary War heroes. In 1834, the fort officially opens, and a portion of the United States artillery, a company, will come down here and they will actually man the fort. Now, over at Fort Gaines, which we have a different video of, that fort's named after a guy named Edmund Pendleton Gaines. He is a War of 1812 hero. That fort really isn't completed up until about the American Civil War. It's a really neat fortification, but that's another story for another time for that sister fort. But at Fort Morgan, the idea at Fort Morgan is to protect the channel. And the channel in Mobile is very, very narrow. And the Confederates make it even more narrow by putting obstructions from the west to the east, from Fort Gaines all the way over to a minefield. A minefield in the American Civil War is also known as a torpedo field. We think of torpedoes from World War I or World War II, famous movies like Das Boot or U-571, seeing a torpedo streaking across the water. Well, that's not the way the Civil War torpedo worked. It's essentially a floating barrel that is a mine, a sea mine, as we would think today. They're not weatherproofed well enough, but they are deadly to Federal or Confederate ships if you have to move in and out of the Mobile Bay. So what the Confederates have done is actually narrowed the channel. The guns of Fort Gaines, only one of them can actually support Fort Morgan because their guns are antiquated. They're smoothbore. They can fire for about 1.75 miles. I'm sorry, about 1.25 miles. But Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines are 3 miles apart. So we put up wood pilings to start with. Those are obstructions that will tear at the hulls of Union ships. And then we put up a torpedo field. And then we leave an open channel so our blockade runners can move in and out and be covered under the guns of Fort Morgan. Now, this also forces the Federals, if they're going to attack into Mobile Bay, to be pushed either towards the guns of Fort Morgan, and there are about 46 guns inside of Morgan. Most of them will be down towards the water level. The idea is to skip shells across the water, and that would be a way to take out the hull of the ship and sink the ship. There'll also be guns up on higher parts of the fortifications, which can take down the rigging of the ships. Because remember, we have hybrid ships at this time. We have some that are steam, we have some that are all sail, and then we have the hybrids that are both steam and sail, like the USS Hartford, which is David Glasgow Farragut's flagship. So if the Federals try to go through the channel, They're either going to have to contend with a minefield to the west, or they're going to have to deal to the east with Fort Morgan. Regardless, it will be a very difficult needle to thread. And then to add to the woes of the Federals, the Confederates actually have a navy. Yes, I said Confederate Navy. There are some ships down here, and to make it very confusing for you, two of them are named the Gaines and the Morgan. So we also have forts and we have ships named the same. We also have the Selma, and then we have the CSS Tennessee, which is an underpowered, oversized Confederate ram. And it's exactly what you think. There is a large protruding ram that's going to come out the front of this ship. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in our other video or later in this video. But this large ram will come out. What you want to do is get up ahead of steam and literally ram into a ship. The problem with the Tennessee is it's many, or I should say the problems. The steering is actually exposed. It's an exterior steering column. So that means that the Federals can shoot at their steering. The ship is underpowered. It doesn't have a large enough power plant or steam plant to move the ship quickly through the water. It is heavily armored, which is fantastic, and it has 6 Brook rifles. And these 6 Brook rifles or 6 Brook cannons are state of the art for the Confederates, but the Confederates aren't good at making friction primers, and these friction primers are going to be a real problem when they go to try to fire the guns. Only 1 gun will actually fire of the 6 on the Tennessee. So this is a large floating fortification that's slow moving like a big turtle, but it is dangerous, and the Federals are worried about this ship. So that's kind of what it looks like. Then if you go up towards Mobile, and I want to talk about the city for a moment, as well as Alabama's entry into the Civil War. You go up towards the city, you do have other fortifications. You'll have what's called Spanish Fort later on. You'll have Fort Blakely, which is our great friend Mike Bunn over there. We'll talk to him on this trip. And you have fortifications around the city. But the city itself isn't that important to the Federals. It is a large city by Confederate standards in 1861. There's almost 30,000 people living in the city of Mobile. It is in lower Alabama. It's on Mobile Bay and on the Mobile River. And it's a place that is really a mixed bag for the Confederates. When the Southerners in South Carolina decide to secede in December of 1860, it's a unanimous vote for secession, and South Carolina secedes. Now, the lower South or the deep South states are going to start to follow suit by holding secession conferences or secession rallies, and Alabama figures, or at least some in Alabama figure, that they're going to secede very quickly, and it's going to be unanimous. And in fact, they go over to South Carolina, bring in some of those secession delegates, and say, "Hey, come on over here and help us out." And in reality, when the call for secession comes in Alabama, it's tepid at best. It's met with mixed results. The vote between the secession delegates will be 61 to 39, 61 in favor of secession, 39 against. Only 54% of all Alabamians who are eligible to vote came out to vote for those representatives to go and vote for the secession. So you only have a 54% turnout for voters to come out and be like, "Hey, should we secede or not? Let's go vote for some people to go out to this conference for us." There's a second call for a second secession vote between some of the Alabama delegates. And they said that, look, so few people came out, we should have a referendum. Should we actually secede or not? And that vote to have a second referendum for secession was actually an even closer vote, 53 for and 46 against. And most of the Alabamians are cooperationists. Not that they want to cooperate with the Union. They actually want to cooperate with other southern states. They want to sit back and wait and see, hey, the South Carolinians, these hotheads have seceded and they're on their own. What's Virginia going to do? What's North Carolina, Tennessee, and others going to do? And so you have this sentiment that are like, hey, we don't want to secede. We have others who do want to secede. And in fact, we have a neutral meeting up in Warren County at a place called Looney's Tavern who say, you know what, we're not going to secede from the Union. We're going to secede from Alabama and let y'all figure out what your mess that you're getting into. That didn't kind of work out. And in fact, North Alabama is heavily Unionist, and down in Pensacola, Florida, which falls to the Federals in May of 1862, that's going to be a hotbed for Unionists who will flee Alabama and other parts of Florida and Georgia and go down to this Union stronghold to go down there. So the idea for secession is not met with a lot of welcoming results. In fact, there's a guy in Mobile who flies the American flag throughout the whole Civil War, and he's never bothered right down on Main Street. Regardless, Mobile is very, very important. There's more than $3.7 million in exports coming in and out of the city. There's a lot of wealth down here. It's the founding of Mardi Gras down in Mobile, Alabama. There's a lot of wealth down here. There's a lot of folks who aren't that wealthy. In fact, there's a whole club in Mobile known as the Can't Get Away Club, because they can't get away from the heat of the summer. And that is, you have the rich people who leave the city. You have the other people who have to stay in the city. So when we start to look at Mobile, we start to look at Alabama, it's a really interesting story. And it's more than just that Battle of Mobile Bay. And to add to that story, the governor, Andrew Moore, will, in fact, before the state secedes, start sending troops to Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, and even put troops on the Florida Alabama border, threatening Florida to come into the Confederacy, even though Alabama hasn't left the Union yet. So we have these acts of war today we would consider, domestic terrorist acts, almost, where they're going and taking over federal installations. It's a fascinating story to get into, and it's more than just this battle, but we're down here at Fort Morgan to talk about that battle, and I want to kick it over to Kris Mackowski to jump in a little bit and see what he has to say about Mobile and what's happening here on Mobile Bay in August of 1864.
Kris, thank you very much. It's important to note that Mobile at the time of the war is the fourth largest city in the Confederacy, but before that it was the 17th largest city in the United States. So it's pretty small by overall standards, but becomes outsized in its importance for the Confederacy. At this point in the war, that importance is really tied to the industrial centers in northern Alabama around Selma, for instance. And you can follow the river network up from Mobile up to Selma. And so that's one of the things that still keep the Deep South going in the war at this point. But because of the construction of Mobile Bay that Kris talked about, this long, relatively narrow bay, all you have to do is choke off the mouth of the bay down across Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, and that then kind of chokes off access to all of that industrial infrastructure up north. And so that's why they're kind of finally turning their attention at this point down to Mobile. Farragut's been looking at it for a while, but it's not until after the fall of Vicksburg in the summer of '63 that he's really able to divide his fleet, stretch out his blockade a little bit more, and really focus on Mobile. In fact, even after the fall of Vicksburg, Grant wanted to then turn his attention to Mobile, and instead is kind of sidelined for a little bit because of a jealous Henry Halleck, and then eventually he finds himself into Chattanooga. So it's really going to fall to Farragut to kind of make sure that the city does get targeted, because they do need to choke off that industrial infrastructure. I'm going to ask Kris in his magic editing to bring back up the map of the American Battlefield Trust that shows this battle, because, as we talk about those sandbars, we can see on the map that's going to affect the way that Farragut's able to approach the bay in the first place. He's had his eye on this for months and months and months. He knows about those torpedoes, for instance. He knows about the obstructions that are in the mouth of the bay. He knows where the channel is. And if we look at this map, I want you to envision a backwards S, but then stretch the ends of the S up and down. So we've got a long, thin curve, and you can see the channel going up through those light areas on the map in that long curve. And so that's the needle that Farragut has to thread. And as he gets his ships into position, he's got to cram everything into that narrow channel and go up and through. So he's going to employ a tactic that he actually used during the Battle of Port Hudson, where he lashes his ships together, kind of taking one of the bigger ones and the smaller ones and lashing them together so that if one of them gets disabled in the course of the fighting, the strength of the paddle wheel of the other, the steam engine, can keep it going. And so that's going to, again, just allow him to push up through and get into the bay away from those artillery pieces and give him the opportunity to catch his breath. He's also going to then take his ironclads and swing them in onto the right side of the channel and act as basically iron shields to help protect his wooden boats as they shift forward. And we can see on that map how those ironclads actually have to come from the west and basically, like a knight on a chessboard, do a couple blocks over and then a couple blocks straight up. You're moving in almost a right angle, and that's going to allow them to assist in threading that needle. You'll have the Tecumseh taking the lead there, the Manhattan. You've got Farragut's Winnebago. Who knew that Admiral Farragut had a Winnebago? But in fact, he does. And then there's the Chickasaw, and they're going to act as shields and absorb a lot of the fire from Fort Morgan that's going to let these wooden ships go by. The other thing that Farragut's bringing into this battle is 60 years of experience. At this point, he is 63 years old. He's been in the Navy his whole career. On the other side, Benjamin Franklin Buchanan, let me get that out of my mouth. He's 64 years old. They're both extremely experienced. And so we're really going to see kind of like the top Navy guys of each side trying to square off. And Buchanan's going to be, as Kris said, there is a Confederate Navy, but Buchanan is going to be way behind the 8 ball in the forces that he's able to bring to bear. He's only going to have about 1,500 men in this battle compared to about 5,000 Navy guys. And then there are going to be some Army components as well. Now, if you take a look at the picture that's behind me, and then I'm going to let Garry chime in because I said the word pictures, and of course that's going to get Garry's attention. I want to show this picture here behind me. I'm standing on the battlements in this photo of Fort Morgan looking across Mobile Bay. Fort Gaines would be off in this direction right in here. And we're going to talk about this little marker right here, one of the very few monuments on a battlefield to Navy casualties. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Let me pitch it over to Garry.
Thanks, Kris. Yeah, I did just come in right at the right time. In fact, I was coming on to give you a hard time and to make the rarest of all things, a Garry Adelman Navy book recommendation. One, by your calculation, it seems like Farragut was a sailor starting at age 3. That's pretty impressive, dude.
Yeah, math. Yeah, that's right. So
we're historians here, not mathematicians. And 2, I want to recommend the book West Wind, Flood Tide. It is an excellent account of all that preparation that Kris Mackowski was just getting into between the tides, marshaling the forces, working with the sea islands and channels and everything like that. It was an excellent read. So I want to recommend that, because that and videos like this, and actually going to the very cool Fort Morgan and seeing how much more there is to see around Mobile, as we will show you in this video series, I just can't recommend it enough.
One thing I want to say before we kick over back into Fort Morgan is just to touch a little bit more on the Confederate commanders here, because we're going to jump right into the action whenever you see us standing high atop the parapet of Fort Morgan. And one of the commanders down there will be a guy named Dabney Maury. Maury is the overall commander of the Confederate forces in Mobile. He's probably not a name that you've heard of unless you've been from probably the Fredericksburg area or Mobile. Maury is a West Point graduate of the class of 1846. He's from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Maury Middle School is named after him. Maury's overseeing the defenses of Mobile. Down in Fort Morgan specifically, you'll have Richard Page. Page is a cousin of Robert E. Lee. Page was actually an old salty sea dog prior to the war. And then comes into Confederate service, joins up with the Confederate land forces. And at first, people at Fort Morgan really liked him. Many of the soldiers liked Richard Page, and then they got to know him. And then, to paraphrase one of his officers, they'll say, he comes up with these great ideas. And the only thing that will push that idea out of his head is his next idiotic idea. So I wouldn't say that he comes up with grand ideas. Fort Morgan, at its height of the Confederacy, will have at one point about 1,000 soldiers in it. But during the battle, it'll be around 600 man garrison that's going to be down here at Morgan. There's great accounts of Fort Morgan about cows being up on the glazed sea grazing. There'll be a large citadel in the middle of the fort, which most people think is actually the fortification, but it's not. It's a citadel inside of the larger fortification. And this is what we call a third system fort. So Richard Page is in charge specifically of Fort Morgan. Dabney Maury is in charge of all of Mobile Bay. Colonel Anderson will be in charge of Fort Gaines. So we have other commanders. But I want you to think about, at the time, we also have Franklin Buchanan. But what I want you to think about, if you are the Confederates, you have this massive bay. I mean, for us to get to this fort, it's a story in and of itself. We drove up to there's a ferry between the two islands, and the very grumpy guy who was running the ferry that day, who wouldn't even acknowledge our existence for the first few minutes, said the ferry wasn't running because they had broken down the ferry. So we actually had to drive all the way around Mobile Bay, which took us probably 3.5 hours from one end to the other to get out to Fort Morgan. It was worth a trip. It's absolutely worth a trip. I recommend it. There's other places to stop along the way, which we did, and we're going to take you to as we go along. But to get to Fort Morgan, you can take the ferry between Dauphin Island, once known as Massacre Island, and Mobile Point. So, you know, it's a cool way to go. I'll have some pictures of you, and I actually took the ferry earlier in 2022. But to get out to this place, it's in the middle of nowhere. William T. Sherman was down here. One of his first postings after West Point was here in Mobile, and he's 30 some odd miles away from the city. When you think about these forts, you're going to deal with sand fleas. You're going to deal with sand blindness. These white sands are beautiful, but you're out here on this sand. It's desolate at the time. There's no cell phones. We don't have telegraph lines down here. All we have is a small boat that could take you out to different places like Bay Minette or up to Mobile. You have boredom to deal with. You also have water problems to deal with. You have to have cisterns down here to collect the rainwater to get that fresh water, because what you're having is brackish water coming down Mobile Bay, where the Mobile River, the Tensas River, and other rivers come into the seawater that is the Gulf of Mexico and creates a brackish water. So the Confederates are dealing with boredom, as would the United States Army when they're down here. They're dealing with the size of this area. So to send a message down to the mouth of the bay, it's going to take a long time. To get it across the bay can take a long time. And that's what you're going to deal with if you're the Confederates. So the communication's a problem. Moving troops around here is a problem. And of course, the Federals, the United States Navy, United States Army, they're a problem too. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump back to Fort Morgan, and we're going to get right into the action. And then you'll see us one more time to wrap everything up for you. So Farragut, that morning of August 5th, 1864, has a hot cup of coffee in his hand, and he decides that it's time to attack. And he is going to send his fleet in a converging pattern, swinging around the front of Mobile Point, and then others coming in from the west. Those are his ironclads, and they're going to start running into the channel and pushing their way into Mobile Bay. Now, Mobile Bay is huge. It's 32 miles to Mobile itself. So in reality, what Farragut is doing is trying to seal off the bay itself, because it's the second most used port by blockade runners for the Confederacy, number one being Wilmington, North Carolina. We shot some videos there 2 years ago. Check those ones out and learn more about the blockade runners up there with our friend Kris. But down here, we have men and boats coming in for the Federals through Grant's Pass. We have a force of U.S. Army moving down Dauphin Island, and now we have this convergence of Farragut's main fleet. And as they start to move into this area, Farragut is going to send his boats in, and as they start to come into here, we have some problems. Number one is the USS Brooklyn that is leading the way. They actually have this form of minesweeping on the front of the Brooklyn, and that's why it's the first ship out there. And as it's going forward, these minesweepers are supposed to either push away the mines or clear the channel for the rest of the main fleet. Unfortunately, the captain of the Brooklyn doesn't seem to have a lot of faith in these arms out on his boat. And in fact, he stops his boat and starts to back it up at one point of this battle. And in the meantime, we start to see the USS Tecumseh. It had just arrived the day before. It's an ironclad vessel, and its captain, Captain Craven, starts to push that ship out towards the minefield. As they go out towards the minefield, immediately the USS Tecumseh hits a mine and it explodes. There are 113 sailors on this ship. 21 of them get off. The rest of them will be today in a watery grave just off of the point. And in fact, I can see the buoy marker for where the USS Tecumseh went down right from where we're standing. The last man off of the boat was the pilot. The pilot left the pilot house, started climbing, went to the ladder. He ran into Captain Craven, who said something along the lines of, because I don't have my quotes in front of me, go ahead, pilot. And as the pilot climbed up, he looked back and all he could see is seawater coming in, and it took down Captain Craven and 92 sailors and officers of the USS Tecumseh, and that is their final resting place out here in Mobile Bay. Now, this is going to shake part of the fleet. In fact, we'll lose another ship, the USS Philippi, in the process of trying to take Mobile Bay. But Farragut is angry. He gets up into the rigging at some point and has to be tied into the rigging of the main mast. And he's going to be giving orders to Captain Drayton of the USS Hartford, in fact, the man who's in charge of the Hartford, his flagship. And he's going to start pointing in different things, and he's screaming down, and supposedly he will say something along the lines of, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And that will be in reaction to the fact that the Brooklyn is starting to move around. Now, there's a lot of different things he may have said, and there's probably a lot more cuss words that he actually used, because he is an old salty sea dog. But the Hartford will start to move forward, and in fact, some of the ships will start touching that minefield. And some of the officers said they could hear the tripwires of those mines going off, but they never exploded. They knew that they were setting off the mines, but Mother Nature most likely had disarmed most of that minefield. There will be other mines out here that will, torpedoes, out here that will take down other ships up in Mobile Bay, but the most famous is the Tecumseh. Now, Farragut keeps pushing in, and as he keeps pushing in farther and farther, now he has to engage with the Tennessee. This also shakes the captain of the Brooklyn, who was, again, in the lead ship. He's worried about taking on the Tennessee, which is a ram, which means it has a pointed iron prod coming out the front of it, 6 Brook guns. In fact, they can only fire 1 because the Confederates were pretty terrible at making friction primers, and they didn't have enough friction primers for all the guns, so they're only firing 1 Brook gun. But it's so heavily armored that the Tennessee is going to now be battered. In fact, Farragut will run these guns. He will take his fleet up into about where you might be able to see one of the rigging stations up there, and he'll put his fleet at anchor for a little bit. He's out of the range of the guns of Fort Gaines. In fact, only one of Fort Gaines's guns could reach us. The rest couldn't even help in the battle. Then over here, the guns of Fort Morgan couldn't reach out that far and hit the guns, or hit the boats of Farragut. And at about 8:30 in the morning, he tells his men to have breakfast and get ready for the next phase of action. And that's when the Tennessee starts coming towards them. And Farragut, being Farragut, says something along the lines of, "I didn't think old Buck would be that stupid to come and attack this whole fleet with his one ship." And out goes the Hartford, the Lackawanna, and other ships, and they will start to surround and pound this ship. I think it's the USS Monongahela or the Lackawanna, I can't remember which one, has a ram on it. And they went at full speed ahead and rammed the Tennessee, and they said they never even made a dent in it. That's how powerful it was. When they finally captured the Tennessee, the CSS Tennessee, the Federals go out there to look to see where that ram had actually hit that ship, and they couldn't even find a dent. They couldn't find it at all. So it's a well-made ship in some regards. It's underpowered. It doesn't have good ammunition on it, and it also doesn't have a good steering system, which is shot away. As the battle goes on for about 4 hours, Franklin Buchanan is wounded, has a broken leg, and the sailors of the CSS Tennessee are surrounded. And eventually, the U.S. fleet captures the Tennessee. A few other ships will run aground, one will be destroyed, and Fort Morgan stands, as does Fort Powell, as does Fort Gaines. Well, that night, the commander of Fort Powell decides discretion's a better part of valor, and he abandons the post and explodes his fort, and he's court-martialed later. Then Fort Gaines will fall to Gordon Granger a few days later. In fact, out to the flagship, the Hartford, will go Charles Anderson, the man in charge of Fort Gaines. He'll go out there, talk to Farragut, and he will surrender. In the meantime, his boss, Dabney, General Dabney, will say, "Hey, he's not allowed to surrender." Too late, buddy. He's already surrendered Fort Gaines. It goes down. Now we have to focus on the most powerful fort, and that is Fort Morgan. General Page, who's over here, is going to now have to prepare for a siege operations, land siege, and that will be the U.S. Army will be landed out onto a Mobile point, and they will start moving their way towards us. And then the Federal fleet will now start to pound this fort on August 22nd. And after about a 24-hour bombardment from land and sea, again, discretion the better part of valor, Fort Morgan will surrender on August 23rd, 1864. It is not until April 12th, 1865, that the city of Mobile Bay falls, or Mobile, Alabama falls. Mobile Bay was the key prize. Now that it's cut off from the sea, there's no need to send a force up there until March and April of 1865, which we'll check out at places like Fort Blakely, Spanish Fort, and others. But the Battle of Mobile Bay is one of the most famous naval actions in all of American history, and mostly because of Admiral David Farragut's famous catchphrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead."
And when Kris and I were talking last night about Farragut and Buchanan, these two guys have 100 years of maritime experience between the two of them. So these two grizzled veterans really taking everything they know and putting it against each other here in a pretty incredible display of naval intelligence. One of the things that impressed me most is Farragut's getting ready to launch his attack at 4:30 in the morning, 4:25 in the morning. He's waiting for the tide to be going in so that he can ride the tide, which means that he can keep the boilers in his steamers on a lower intensity, which makes them less dangerous to the crew. They don't have to have as much steam up, so they don't have to have as much power because the tide's doing the work for them. As he lashes his ships together, the idea is that if one of them is disabled, it's attached to another ship, which can still carry it forward and not bottleneck that very narrow opening to the bay. Those mines that Kris has talked about on several occasions, Farragut knew they were there. Remember, they've been studying this bay for years. We're going to head back into the studio here for a second because, of course, technology, I'm going to blame it on an errant seagull that flew over our equipment at just the wrong time. That's going to be my official excuse. But as we talk about all this experience that these two commanders have, it's really going to parlay to great success for Farragut, who will go on to be promoted by December by Lincoln to become Vice Admiral of the Navy. He's the first Vice Admiral of the Navy that the Navy will ever have, and then he'll go on to become Admiral. But the Battle of Mobile Bay will be his last real efforts out in the field, if you'd call being on the water out in the field. But he is going to parlay that to great career success. The city of Mobile won't fall for months and months and months. Even though this takes place in August, it has a huge, huge value because it chokes off the bay. And we've talked over and over about all the ship traffic in and out. And if you can close off the mouth of this bay, then you can basically start choking off everything through Mobile and up into the industrial center of Alabama. And so that's going to start happening because they can't bring goods in and out through the bay. We're going to talk about those stories and all the rest of Alabama's Civil War history as we go on. It won't be until April of 65 that the Battle of Fort Blakely will then finally open up the avenue into Mobile, which will then fall a couple days after Robert E. Lee surrenders in Appomattox up in Virginia. That's how long Mobile holds on, but its relevance really gets taken off the board because of this battle here in August. The other huge repercussion of this battle is that it starts to turn around Lincoln's fortunes. He's had a really, really bad few years of stalemate in the war, particularly in the East. His election prospects coming up in November have been looking more and more grim as both Sherman and Grant have bogged down in their various campaigns. And finally, here's the first real glimmer of light that Lincoln sees that's going to start to open things up. Eventually, the fall of Atlanta in September is really what's going to kind of open those floodgates. And then, of course, Sheridan's success in the Valley. So this is going to be the first in those few dominoes that's really going to lead to Lincoln's re-election. So that's the other main repercussion. I see Garry popping back in with his jaunty little hat. We're going to turn things over to him and talk some more about the history of this in pictures.
I like the pejorative sort of little hat on there. I do have a small head, so thank you for that, Kris. I want to add on there for people who are fans of that area south of Richmond and really bring up Chaffin's Farm or that area around Newmarket Heights as another kind of strong point that helped Lincoln's election. And then let me just add that as we embark on this video series, just if you're a Civil War person, just think of August of 1864 and April of 1865. There are things that happen in between, and there are things that happen before and after as well. But those are going to be your main areas of focus to bring sort of Civil War Mobile into focus. Lastly, we hope that this video doesn't replace your visit to Fort Morgan, because let me tell you, it is cool. There's nothing like walking through the Sally Port and experiencing what those soldiers experienced. Check out the cool hot shot furnace they have there, and bring with you or look in the visitor center outside of the historic photos they have there. That's yet another place that there's no photos of it that I know of until the Union occupied it, and then that brought up Union photographers. So we'll flash some of those photos up as well. And it enhances the experience when you're actually there. I'm going to kick it over to Kris, and I think he might be wrapping this up.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And I want to just mention that, Mobile is under siege for a very short amount of time during the war, and it's a really great story. Get into downtown Mobile as well. We're going to get you up to Magnolia Cemetery on this video swing. And I do want to say that, it was still mixed throughout the entire war. Should they be part of the Confederacy? Shouldn't they be? There's Unionist sentiment there. But the blockade really impacts the city financially. The price of flour is going to skyrocket to $400 per barrel by 1864. Molasses, butter, anything else you could think of is going to start to skyrocket. You'll also have in the city, to try to fight this, a tax that doesn't take off. That it's this tax that's suggested, hey, you should pay this tax to help out the city as well as the Confederacy, and it's like, yeah, that's not going to take off. These suggested taxes, and it became so bad down in Mobile financially after the war that by the 1870s, the late 1870s, the Alabama government for about a decade had to take over. The state government had to take over the management of the city because the finances were just so devastated, not only because of the war, but because of other things taking on during Reconstruction. So there's more to the story down here in Mobile, but I want to encourage folks to go head out to Mobile Bay, especially get out to Forts Gaines and Morgan. They are great third system forts. The fort at Fort Morgan is operated by the state. When I was out there, I've been out there a lot, about a year ago, there was actually a Universal Soldier weekend. So they had the whole life of the fort from the War of 1812 era, when there was a battle out there, through the Civil War. They had a World War II encampment, even with Japanese reenactors who were out there. So you want to confuse a visitor, walk out there sometime and be like, hey, I'm coming to a Civil War fort, and there's all this out here. But it was really neat. And the fort itself will actually be used into the 20th century. It's an active fort during the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. There's an airstrip that's installed there, kind of like Fort Fisher. There are 12-inch Seacoast guns that are used, disappearing guns or peekaboo guns. One of the big things that you will see when you walk into the fort is Battery du Portail, which is a large black cement fortification, painted black, and it's named after Louis du Portail, who was one of the engineers for George Washington's army at Valley Forge. He wasn't down at Fort Morgan, even though Fort Morgan's designed by a French engineer. And there are other batteries around, like Battery Schenck, that will help to defend the seacoast during the Spanish-American War and the World Wars. It's finally decommissioned, I think, in 46 or 47, 1947, and then turned over to the Alabama State. So it's part of the state park system down there. So if you ever get a chance to, you're going to actually see a fortification that has a lifespan that is going to come from basically the War of 1812 and the wake of War of 1812 all the way up through the Second World War. And it's a really neat place. And if you go to their museum, which sits out just outside the fort, and you look at the design of it, it's actually designed after the old citadel that would have been inside the fort itself. So it's a really neat use of interpretation down there. And before I wrap up, I want to see if anybody has anything else.
Last thing I just want to mention, just point out the marker that's behind me. We've talked about the sinking of the Tecumseh. And usually when seamen go to their watery graves, there's no way to mark where that happened. And here's one of those very few instances where there is a marker. The buoy, it surprised me just how close to shore it really was. And of course, the shore has shifted over time and has crept in and out as the tides have brought sand in and taken it away. But you can stand here at the edge of Fort Morgan and see that marker and think about those 96 men that went down in the Tecumseh. And it's, I think, a really poignant experience at a very beautiful, desolate spot. Kris mentioned, the effort it took to get down there, and it was well worth it. It is such an impressive fortification. It was such an impressive experience. The company was fantastic, and you have the chance to stand there and reflect across that beautiful bay about the cost of war.
Yeah, and in fact, the first Alabama soldier to die in the American Civil War died at Fort Morgan in 1861. He fell off the dock, most likely, into Mobile Bay and drowned, and his body was found 3 days later. So that was the first Alabama soldier to die in the Civil War. Happened here at Fort Morgan, not under gunfire. So I think that's going to wrap it up here. And so on behalf of Kris Mackowski, Garry Adelman, Andy Polton, who's helping out to edit these videos, I'm Chris White. We hope that you'll head down to Mobile. We're taking you there virtually, but we hope that you'll get down there. check out the city, everything it has to offer. It's a fantastic place. It's a family-friendly New Orleans is how they sold it on me when we were holding an event down there. And it's just a beautiful city, largely untouched by the hand of war. Yes, there will be devastating fires there, but not because of the American Civil War. But there are 5 fires that ripped through the city in the 1800s and the 1900s. And unfortunately, they didn't save all of their historic buildings, but they've come back around to realize just how important their heritage tourism is down there. You can check out the USS Alabama, which is a World War II era South Dakota class battleship, which is awesome. And there's so many sites to see. And we're going to take you around Mobile to some of those sites, including Spanish Fort, Fort Blakely, and down into Magnolia Cemetery. So on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.